Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Transition to Employment webinar series. We will get started with the first webinar of the series in just another minute. We do still have a few people logging into the webinar, and we want to give them a chance to join as well. So in about 1 minute, we'll get started. Again, if you've just joined us, we will be starting the webinar in just under a minute. We're letting the rest of the audience members log in. Okay, and it actually looks like the logging in has slowed down, so we will go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Brown, and I am with the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, Transition and Employment Projects, and I will be your moderator for today. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and is funded in whole or in part by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, also known as OSEP. Support for the webinar is also provided through a contract with Children's Special Health Services at the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. Please note that the statements shared in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the sponsoring departments. All audience members are currently muted. This allows to hear the presenters more readily. It cuts down on the background noise. However, your questions are welcome at any time during the webinar. If you do want to ask one of the presenters a question or make a comment, please type your question or comment into the chat box. And please note that only you, myself as the moderator, and the presenters will be able to see what you have typed into that chat box. The other audience members will not be able to see what you've typed into the chat box. If you don't see the chat box on your screen right now, look to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and there should be a white arrow inside of an orange box. If you click on that arrow, it will open up a dashboard or a dialog box, and in there you should see chat or questions, and that's where you'll be able to type in any of your comments or questions. For those of you who requested Montana Office of Public Instruction renewal units when you registered, those will be emailed to you after the webinar, and it can take up to a couple of weeks to get those sent out. Please note that you do have to have pre-registered in order to receive the OPI credit. And unfortunately, we're not currently able to issue other kinds of attendance documentation. Today's session is being audio taped for the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and Transition and Employment Project's resource libraries, and the recording for the webinar will be posted to the training archives pages for both of those projects, so for the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and also for the Transition and Employment Projects. And in just a moment, when I'm finished doing the introduction, I will go ahead and put the website URLs or website addresses for both of those training archive pages in your chat box. It can take us up to a couple of weeks to get those recordings posted, but if you're interested in sharing today's information with other people, check in a couple of weeks on our websites and you'll have the links that you can send out, or you can send me an email and I can let you know when those links have been posted. Please note that the slides for today's session and the handout that Ellen will be referencing are already available. If you look again in that dashboard or drop-down menu on your GoToWebinar page, you'll see that one of the options you can select is handouts, and it should say 3 of 5. As I said, we have the slides for today's presentation on there. We have one of the handouts that Ellen will be referencing. And we have a fuller biography for both of today's presenters if you're interested in learning a bit more about their backgrounds. So those handouts are available for download at any time. When you log out of the webinar today, a short survey will pop up. We do ask that you please take the time to answer those survey questions. The information will go back to the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and will be used to look for topics for future sessions and also to continue improving the training that you're being offered at this time. So again, please do take a few minutes to fill out that survey. And with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce and thank our speakers today. We are very lucky to have both Ellen Condon and Teresa Baldry with us. Ellen is the project director for the Rural Institute's Transition and Employment Projects and for the Montana Deafblind Project, both at the University of Montana, where she has worked since 1996 on transition and employment for youth with significant disabilities. She is currently working as a consultant to NCDB, which is the National Center on Deafblindness, in the area of transition to employment and community life for students with deafblindness and intellectual disabilities, and she's also a consultant with Mark Gold and Associates. Teresa Baldry is based in Miles City and is the project coordinator for the Montana Deafblind and the Children's Special Health Services transition projects. She has worked as an assistive technology consultant for Montech and project coordinator for the Pre-Employment Transition Services Technical Assistance Center at the Rural Institute. Teresa is a parent of 6 children, including a son with a disability. She began her work in the disability field due to her need to understand the information and systems that would directly impact her son, who is now a young adult. His need for assistive technology, including systems for communication, created opportunities for Teresa to learn and share. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Ellen and Teresa.
Thank you, Kim. This is Ellen Condon, and like Kim said, both Teresa and I work at the Montana Deafblind Project, which is based at the University of Montana's Rural Institute. We have both our Facebook page and our website page at the bottom of this title slide, and so we'd love for you to visit both of them and see some of the resources that we've been adding. This is part 1 of a 3-part webinar series. The whole purpose of this series is to look at the possibility of employment for students with a significant impact of disability, and in our case, students with deafblindness and additional disabilities. The first webinar, what we're going to do is talk about just a strategy called customized employment and show you just how that might work to lead us to be able to envision a life of community-based employment for somebody with a significant impact of disability. The second webinar, which is on April 16th and will require a separate registration, we're going to go more into the specific strategies you're going to use to get to know the individual student, to think about what their gifts are, what their strengths are, what could they offer an an employer, and for tasks in a work experience. The final webinar is September 17th, and that webinar is going to walk you through how do you take the information that you've learned about this individual student through these strategies, and how do you translate them into a well-matched work experience for that student. Because like what for this population, because we're dealing with students here, what we are going to focus on is really thinking about envisioning that end goal of employment in the community for them. But the steps we're going to take are, what are some of the transition activities that we can do, and what are the specific work experience activities that we can do as a team, and working with the family and other members of the IEP team for that student to best prepare them for community employment or competitive integrated employment. So I want to introduce this term to you, competitive integrated employment, because this is a term that's referenced as the goal of transition, of what we're preparing for with students with disabilities, as defined in the Rehab Act of 2014, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And so what competitive integrated employment is, it's a job in the community at minimum or prevailing wage, so nothing less than minimum wage is allowed if it's competitive integrated employment. There has to be the same level of integration in this individual's job as there is with anybody else in that same type of employment. So say that we're working with a student and they're working in, I don't know, a greenhouse, or they're working on a landscaping crew. For it to be considered competitive integrated employment, it has to be paid at minimum wage or above in the community with the same opportunities for interaction with people without disabilities, either who are customers or who are coworkers, as anybody else in that line of work. The other piece that makes employment competitive integrated employment is that the employee has the same access to any advancement and benefits as anybody else in that job. So, as we're talking about planning for post-school outcomes, I just want to make it really clear what we are talking about, and that we are talking about competitive integrated employment. So, going back to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, since this has passed in 2014, a lot of states are still figuring out how to implement it. And this is the rehabilitation legislation. So it impacts rehab the most, but there's a huge emphasis on students. Part of the directive to every state's voc rehab, this is a national law, is that voc rehab has to spend 15% of their state budget on students with disabilities. So they are working with young adults much earlier than they were in the past, before the authorization of WIOA. Some of the other changes is really that the expectation of employment in the community is high, and it's for everybody, for students and adults. Whereas we may have thought in prior years that voc rehab wasn't an agency that served students with a more significant impact of disability, what WIOA is directing them to do is really look at the possibility of employment for everybody. They also, because there's an emphasis on youth and students, their emphasis is that all young adults will have the opportunity to prepare for, obtain, maintain, and advance in or re-enter competitive integrated employment. So that's a real different phrase that describes what VR services do for students now, in contrast to their role in transition and students before 2014. So VR is much more engaged with schools. There's actually a mandate for voc rehab to be working with the Department of Ed and offer collaborative preparation activities for students with disabilities. And so if you haven't engaged with rehab in your state and talked about how things have changed and how they can support young adults with disabilities in preparing for employment, it's a really good time to reach out and see what opportunities are available now that weren't there before. The other piece that came with WIOA is Section 511. And basically what this says is that no student can transition from school directly to sub-minimum wage, which is typically what has been paid in the past in sheltered workshops, without first becoming a client of VR or voc rehab and opening a case, trying competitive and integrated employment, and not achieving an employment outcome, or choosing not to pursue community employment. And also folks need the pre-employment transition services, which are those services funded by VR to help prepare, maintain, and get people into the workforce as students. So there's no direct pipeline of people 24 or younger going from school directly into sheltered work any longer, or sub-minimum wage. So we're going to switch to the next slide. And so again, I want to go back and really emphasize that when I'm talking about competitive integrated employment, we really are talking about everybody. We're talking about people that maybe we didn't even ask the question, do you want to go to work? Before, when we were doing transition planning with these folks. Maybe families have never heard that work in the community is an option for their son or daughter. So this is a young woman who worked with our project years ago, and we did start asking that question. What does she want to do for work? And when you meet somebody with multiple disabilities who doesn't have the language to tell you that they do or don't want to work, or they've never had the experience to know even what work is, we can't wait for them to initiate telling us that they want to go to work. We have to be able to show them what that is and what it could mean for them. And so this is a young woman who had a lot of medical complications. She had a seizure disorder, and so her mornings typically were more productive than her afternoons. She didn't use words to communicate, but she could answer yes and no to different questions that you would ask her. She would answer yes by raising her left hand and answer no by pursing her lips or turning her head away from you. She also could use the switch that's mounted, it's to the left of her head in this picture, to select from a list of 3 different auditory options. She could hit the switch after listening to the 3 and say, I'd like that one, please. Or she could also use her Big Mac to reach out and say, I'd like to tell you something in my book. And the book is that notebook that's brightly colored, and it's positioned under her left hand under the Big Mac switch. And basically in that book were different categories of things that she could ask you or tell you about, things that were relevant to her. She also used a motorized chair, and she could navigate it on a straightaway, but she wasn't able to navigate it around turns. So she needed somebody with her when she was moving the chair, also to set up her technology in order to communicate, or in order to work anything that technology could operate, and to be with her in case of seizures. So this is somebody who I think a lot of us serve in our deafblind projects, are students with multiple disabilities, including vision and hearing loss. And so as we're talking about, or maybe you're talking about in some of your settings, is she really talking about the kids that we're talking about? I would say yes. And so even though probably for years and years in transition meetings, we haven't approached work as a possibility for these students, maybe we're thinking these students would just move into more of a therapy program, or a place where they hung out and did recreation. But this is who we're talking about. And this is who WIOA means, that we will give everybody the opportunity to have that choice of community or competitive integrated employment, and have that opportunity to prepare for it. So as we move to the next slide, we think about, okay, so when I'm talking about work, we're presuming that anyone, regardless of their impact of disability, can work in the community, but there's going to be different ways to earn a living and contribute. So even though most of us without disabilities left high school and went and applied for jobs, maybe it was our first job and we didn't have a lot of skills, but we still had enough skills, enough abilities to market ourselves and apply for different job openings. And wherever our skills matched that employer's need, we were hired. And frequently, when we've talked about why somebody could or couldn't work in the past based on their disability, we may have said, oh, well, they don't have what those employers are looking for. All those employers want somebody that can multitask. They need to be able to read. They need to be able to work like at least 4 hours at a time. What I want to share with you is that we can define that concept of work in different ways. And so when we're looking at somebody who's got complexities of multiple disabilities and vision and hearing loss, these folks may not best access employment through that compete for the job strategy. So what we're going to introduce to you is a different strategy. And what that involves is getting to know who each student is before we look at what kind of jobs they might be able to do. And so we look for somebody's strengths and interests. We look for what motivates them. We have to understand what their support needs are. So when we go back to the young woman that I was just introducing you to, as we talked about work for her and setting up the first couple of work experiences for her, we wanted it to be during the early part of the day. We had to look at proximity to school. Like if she had a seizure and needed to go take a nap for 2 hours, we needed to be pretty close by. So we had just a radius of how far that job could be away. We also had to look at what kind of technology did she need and how was that technology prepared for her to go to work. We needed to know what her support person would have to do. We also needed to know what's going to motivate her to actually participate in, I'm doing finger air quotes, in work. Because, on her first day of a community work experience, it dawned on me we probably had never told her what that concept meant. Because at age 18, we just started really looking at community-based work experience for her, because we had never had that as part of her transition plan before. So we also had to think about why would that be meaningful for her, and what kind of tasks would we have her engage in that are beneficial to an employer, so it's a work experience, but she's motivated to do them. Because this young woman didn't have any interaction with money before. That hadn't been part of what she learned at school or at home either. So we can't just answer the question, okay, so we think everybody's going to go work in the community, so person B, what are you going to do? That's going to take some digging to figure out what's really going to work for this individual. And I guess as the complexity of somebody's impact of disability increases, so does the depth we need to dig in. So let's move to the next slide. And so the point that I'm making is that just because you can't compete for a job doesn't mean you can't work in the community for real pay. And so it just means that you need a different strategy to get there. And so customized employment is that strategy. And this is a strategy that was introduced by the US Department of Labor in 2002. So it's been around for a while. And organizations have been doing training around customized employment. Actually, Mark Golden Associates did some training for the National Center on Deafblindness back when it was NTACT. And we've offered training around the country in customized. But it wasn't until WIOA was passed that the term customized employment was written into the rehab law. And so now, even if you've heard of this, but it hasn't been very available in your state, now it's going to become more available, because all the states need to figure out how do they define it, how do they provide it, what does it look like, and which providers are going to be providing customized employment. And so it's not that I want all the school team members to go out and do customized employment, but I think understanding what the possibilities are for what employment looks like for an individual student that you're working with who's got a significant impact of disability, understanding that that could be different than them going out and applying for a job and not getting it or getting it, helps you see the vision that you're heading towards, that post-school outcome. So what customized is it's it's a strategy that really individualizes what work means for the individual job seeker by looking at what their strengths are, but also what their support needs are and their ideal conditions for success. And at the same time, it does those same things on the employer side. It really looks at what does that employer need that's not being met currently. And so how can this individual offer tasks that they can do and contributions that we know they can make? How do they offer those to an employer such that the employer benefits as well? So in customized employment, it's got to be a win-win solution. Otherwise, it's not bona fide employment. And so the next slide will really illustrate what we typically think of employment. Like we typically think, if you're gonna show us that you're ready for employment, you could learn and would go to an interview and represent yourself. And you would approach employers that are hiring and have those needs, and they've communicated that the need is there to hire. But in customized employment, we're not going to go to employers that have openings. We're not going to do interviews to introduce ourselves. Instead, you do step one of customized employment is really getting to know that student or that adult, and then putting together a list of proposed tasks and contributions, and then meeting with an employer, getting to know what their needs are. And then what you do is you strategically negotiate a job description that works for both the job seeker and the employer. And so this really avoids barriers that are created by job descriptions. Because typically, if you go to an employer who says that they're hiring, they've already bundled all these tasks together, and they have an idea in their head of what the skills and abilities are of the person is that they want to hire to fill that job description. And that all works against somebody with a lot of complexities. So in the past, when employment agencies or voc rehab counselors or teachers or even families and other professionals are saying employers don't hire people with a significant impact of disabilities, many times what we were doing was using a more labor market strategy. People have found a lot of success in getting somebody a job, even somebody with a significant impact of disability, if we start with what that person can offer and then negotiate employment. So what we do is, and it's got to be proactive, and we start on the job seeker side, but we have to get to know. So say we're looking at some of our students who are deafblind across the country. What we need to do as, while they're in school and while we're working in transition is look at how do we determine what their skills are? What tasks, so not job descriptions, not job titles, but what specific tasks could they offer an employer? And also, if we have like 8 years of transition planning, what tasks could we teach them so that they could make a bigger contribution to an employer? And so typically in customized, you contact employers that are going to be a good match for that individual. And so you're very selective in the employers that you go look at. And so even if we're starting with a work experience and we are starting with somebody who has a lot of complexity to their disability, we're going to negotiate an individualized work experience to really show that person that they could be successful at work and show their family that they could be successful at work and give them a real experience where they excel and succeed. And so even in a work experience, we're going to have somebody probably go represent that individual to an employer if we're negotiating an experience that doesn't exist yet, because this person needs something so individualized. So very similar to the young woman we were just talking about. And then in customized job development or in negotiating a work experience, the employer is going to come back with, oh, okay, this would work for me, or no, it won't. And again, it's got to work for both to be a good match. So as we're getting to know the individual job seeker, there's 5 different areas that we need to have clear information about. And the first part is, what are the conditions this person needs for success? So think about, what environmental conditions? Is it, are there types of environments that acoustically work or don't work for an individual you're working with? What about, accommodations for vision, for communication, for, think about the young woman I just introduced you to. One of her conditions was that we were looking at early in the morning. So not super early, but between 9 and 11. Another condition for her was that her stamina was 20 minutes. She could focus on a task for 20 minutes, and then she needed about a 10-minute break, and then she could work another 20 minutes. That was one of her conditions for success. We also knew for her that all of her tasks were going to be done using technology. So we needed to have that technology programmed. We needed to have tasks that worked for her. Some of her preferences and interests, and we couldn't ask her what you really like to do, and it was really hard to follow her because most of her movement, except for her eyes and her head, were guided by somebody else. So we had to figure out, what does she pay attention to during the day? And it was really interesting how we stumbled upon that information, because people would say, she's really distracted by such and such. And so we'd have to back them up and say, well, why do you say that? What do you see? And so what started to become really clear was this young woman she loved watching what other people were doing. The sillier the people, the better. The more animated, the better. But that had to be, she had to have access to that in order to do her work tasks. Some of the contributions that she offered was that she liked to engage with other people. Once she knew you, she would greet you with a great big smile. She was somebody who, once she learned a task, she had that task. And then the tricky part, what task could she offer? So basically, we had to observe. We had to figure out, like, how do her hands work? How does her technology work? How could that be turned into different tasks? So she used a Big Mac switch. So she could use that switch to give people messages, to direct people, to draw people over to her, and then not hand them something, but have something that they should take that was placed on her wheelchair tray. She could also use switches to turn on and off anything that had an on-off switch. So as we were customizing a work experience in the community for her, those were the things that we had to keep in mind. Otherwise, she'd be out in a community setting, but not really participating. So if you switch to the next slide, what was negotiated on her behalf for her first work experience was that she had a task where she would hit the switch to turn on and operate the electric stapler and the electric hole punch. And so we needed a latch switch timer. We needed somebody who physically guided the paper, because that's something that her hands didn't do. And so as her position was negotiated, we negotiated that she would have somebody with her to do the physical parts of the task that she couldn't do. And so she ended up working in, it's a physical therapy business that also functions as this little town's gym and workout area. And when we first started there, we had to make sure that there was enough going on where she was working so that she could watch and engage them, but also do her work tasks. And so in front of her, which isn't shown in the photo, is a large wall of mirrors. So she could watch herself, but also there were 3 volunteer firemen working out with the physical therapist who were clowning around and being quite the entertainment. And the interesting thing was that this was her first community-based work experience. And after a couple months, I ran into the person that was coaching her at the grocery store, and she said, you know, she's actually working a couple hours now. I think she's ready for her next community work experience or her next job. So just having her out there in a job that, or just a work experience that matched who she was and where she'd be successful, and seeing that success enabled somebody who had no prior experience with supported or community employment. And seeing her success changed this person's potential vision of what this young woman's, what her possibilities were for a future. So that's what this 3-part webinar series is about, is how do we propose the possibility of work in the community? What are the strategies we use for people that we really don't know what the answer is, that they, you know, when somebody asks, what are they going to do for work? Or do they want to go to work? Or what can they do for work? You can't answer that big a question with somebody who's got a real complex barrier to employment. We need to break it down into smaller steps to really think about, okay, what would motivate the person to work? How do we find an environment that has that? You know, what supports do they need to be successful? How could that be provided in this work experience? And so as people working in transition, if we can gather all that information and have some of those, you know, the stories of those experiences before somebody graduates, and ideally voc rehab has already been involved, and if developmental disabilities is going to be providing the ongoing supports, then we can share all that information with the adult providers. And so it's much easier for them to pick that up and keep going in community employment than if this young woman exited from high school, nobody had ever talked to her family about work, and she'd never had that experience. This really helps set the stage for people to have higher expectations. So I'm going to fast forward over the next slide that talks about, you know, do employers really hire people? And these are 3 different areas to look at in terms of how would you approach an employer to negotiate a job for somebody. And so again, it's got to make some sort of fiscal difference to that employer. Otherwise, they're not going to pay wages. So it might be something that doesn't get done in their workplace that they'd like to have done. It might be tasks that you could put together that are more cost effectively provided by somebody else. And sometimes it's a service that just enhances and benefits that business. So from there, we're going to move on to the legislation that governs what schools do in terms of transition. So we know that federal legislation says that we have to begin planning for transition the year in which the student turns 16 or earlier if the team deems it as appropriate. If you have a student with a significant impact of disability, even if your state follows the federal law and starts transition planning during the IEP year that the student turns 16, I would advocate that you start earlier. The other piece, the other part of the law is that appropriate measurable post-secondary goals are based on age-appropriate transition assessments. And there hasn't been a lot of direction from the feds around what you have to use for age-appropriate transition assessments. But what I'm going to advocate for is that the more complex the disability, probably the better the student will do in terms of what that assessment shares with you, is if you're headed more towards an informal assessment versus an assessment that's looking at comparing the student to other students with disabilities, or other people that would go into that type of job. So there's a lot of overlap between WIOA and IDEA 2004. And so if we start thinking, okay, so how do we implement some of this work preparation and meet the goals of what schools need to do under IDEA, but also look at how Voc Rehab could step in and support us now that WIOA is mandating them to help in the preparation of all students with disabilities. So as you're looking at the picture in the next slide, you think about age-appropriate transition assessments. We want the assessment for somebody with complex needs to be the glass is half full. Like, what can they do? Where do they do it? What supports help them engage and do different activities? What strategies work really well for them? It's not going to help you think about employment and community living for somebody with a severe disability if the assessment only shows you what they can't do and how they compare to other people. The other thing that some of the traditional assessments might look at when you're thinking about career and vocational is trying to determine what type of job or career path you're going to go into. In customized employment, that doesn't make as much sense. It may make sense to highlight an interest area, and then instead of looking at job titles, you're still going to focus on tasks. And that might, but I think assessing somebody's skills to determine, are you going to go in the mathematics field, or are you going to go in the helping field, or are you going to go in more of an academic field? That's not going to really help somebody with a more significant impact of disability. So what we're going to encourage you to do is learn about the process of discovery and think about how you can use that as an age-appropriate transition assessment. Because when we start down in that bottom left-hand side of the slide on the current levels of performance, basically that's your age-appropriate transition assessment. Where are you now? And then you look at the upper right-hand text box and it says measurable post-secondary goals. So if we say, okay, we're going to say community-based employment is an appropriate goal for any student we're working with. Part of what you do, going back down to your lower left hand, is look at, what skills and activities do we offer to that student as a transition service and activity that prepares them for community employment. Part of it's going to be ongoing learning that the team does about who the student is, where they're at their best, what tasks they can offer. And then also thinking about, growing the student's task list. Or if this is a student that uses technology, growing their various technology tools and expanding the tasks that they can offer an employer using those tools. The other piece is looking at what are those students' ongoing support needs and how are you going to meet them by connecting with your adult service agencies or bartering for supports. I love to barter and negotiate. And as we look at long waiting lists for long-term supports in many states, you may have to get creative in figuring out your long-term supports. And then what we're thinking of in terms of where somebody lives or works. Sometimes if it's a really good match, we may need less formal supports. So it makes it easier to provide long-term supports. So what I'm going to propose is that let's begin with the vision that everybody can work and that students can opt out of work rather than having to show us they're ready. Because with a lot of students and young adults with a significant impact of disability, waiting for them to show us they're ready to work kind of was our excuse not to deal with figuring out how to make it happen for them. And so way too many people didn't go anywhere. So this is a great photo borrowed from the internet about, this kid is obviously a whole lot younger than 16. So how do we introduce that concept of work? So I'm going to ask Teresa just to say a few words about, as a parent, how do we approach parents and talk about work?
Hi, everyone. So a lot of times with parents and children with disabilities, in the very beginning, we start with how they're not measuring up and what predictors for their growth we're not going to use. But we often don't provide a replacement for parents that says you can expect your child will be mobile in some way. You can expect that your child will communicate in some way. We just say you're not meeting these milestones, and so we don't have a piece that we're going to still keep out there for you to be achieving toward. And that becomes difficult when we start to come back at this in later ages and say, we want you to be thinking about employment. Well, they haven't been thinking about their child as part of the community, possibly. And now we're talking about employment and all of the different aspects there. So I think it's really important from the very beginning and as soon as we can to be working alongside families to still have expectations and to be looking at what are we noticing as parents that they are inept to do, that they have a skill to do. If they're completing something and doing something, how can we build that and for them to then understand that's something that they bring that's unique to them, that's a talent, that's a skill that could be used toward employment. So allowing them that same opportunity to explore and believe that work is a part of what should be available to them because of the impact of work on their own lives, such as how they see themselves as part of the community, the benefits that we all receive from being connected to others and contributing. I'll pass it back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Teresa. And so I think that's a huge point. We've got to start this conversation a whole lot earlier as well, so that parents can start thinking about their child earning a wage and making a contribution, and also so that the child can. So let's move to the next slide. And there's a variety of age-appropriate transition assessments, and they can be formal or informal. And we've given you the website address for NTAC's Age-Appropriate Transition Assessment Toolkit further on in the slideshow. So I'm going to recommend that you go there if you want more specifics about age-appropriate transition assessments. And we're going to go to the next slide that talks about what the process of discovery is. And discovery is the first step that you would use when you're looking at customized employment for somebody who isn't going to go out and be successful through a traditional labor market approach to employment. So discovery answers the question, who are you in terms of, where are you most who you are? What kind of support strategies work for you to be happiest, most engaged, help your stamina, support your health so that you can work more hours? Are there times of the day that are better for you than others? And then also, what do you do? And as we're engaging families, I think we need to be able to share with them information about the possibility of customized employment. Because we can't go to families who have been told over and over all the things their child can't do and then say, okay, so what are they going to do for work? Like many of us who have been working in supported employment for years, that still is a tough question when you've got a job seeker with lots of complexities. So we can't saddle the family with answering that question either. So again, what we have to do is start with, who is this person? What works for them? What makes them most who they are? Getting to know them in a different way, a different type of approach to, again, it's the finger quotes in the air, assessment. Because discovery, it's not like your traditional assessments. It's really optimistic. It's going to be descriptive. It's going to be robust. We're going to ask questions about, what do you do? How do you do that? Where do you do that? Because one of the premises in discovery is that we're not going to assume we know all the answers yet about who the person is. Like sometimes in a person-centered planning meeting, you invite all the people to the table that know that person the best, and you ask for their input. If we don't go back out and take another look, we just come to the table with our assumptions of what we know about that person. And a lot of times people with an impact, a significant impact of disability, come with a lot of presumptions about who they are and what they can't do. And what we really want to do in discovery, and we're going to do it through the strategies explained in the next slide, is we want to go out and we want to take another look at what we think we know about the person. So we want to have conversations with them if that's possible. Or we want to have we want to have conversations with people who know them well, but we don't want to ask the question of, okay, what can they do for work? Instead, we want to ask the question about, what do they do? Describe how they do it. What's an environment that gives you the best example of something that really motivates this young person? And what do they do? Like, what do they do without being asked to do it? And you're going to do interviews of people who know the individual student well. And I would say, even if we're identifying what we're going to do for work experiences with somebody, we would want some of this information. If you are a job developer and you need enough information to go negotiate this person's first paid job in the community, you're probably going to sit down and do like 20 hours or 25 hours of facilitated discovery. However, in the school system, what I would suggest is that you fit these discovery activities into the flow of the school year. So when you have to do assessments to inform the IEP, do some of these discovery activities. And it doesn't have to all be done by one person on the team. Maybe the VI consultant goes out and gathers information about how this person sees best, what accommodations help them see and discriminate across different materials. Maybe the speech language professional talks about how best to support the person to communicate. And maybe the family talks about what happens at home and what the individual does for chores and responsibilities and what that looks like. And then you're also going to review records of the person. in school, what different schools have done has been to just add pieces to discovery each year during the IEP. So as we're talking about the possibility of employment for all students, we really want to guide those work experiences with discovery. If we develop a work experience that's not a good match for a student, that student's going to look far less competent in that setting, and it's going to be based on our failure, not that student's failure. So what we really want to do is learn enough about that student so that we can set them up to truly participate in a work experience and to contribute and to learn about work, and for us to learn about their work and their support needs. So some of the discovery activities that you might do is spend time talking to the family at the student's home. See where the student lives. Ask about what routines they and their family have during a weekday, during a weekend. And part of what you're doing is you're learning about strategies the families come up with to support the student get through the day. You're learning about skills and interests that you may not know about, that the student shows at home that they don't have an opportunity to show you at school. The parents may have some really interesting information that they've never thought was interesting to you or applicable to school at all. And siblings can have great perspectives and information. So you're going to interview, you're going to observe, you're going to spend time at school thinking about what does watching this person in this particular activity teach me about who they are? You'd go in the community. So for this is a young man who one of his work experiences turned into what he did as his job after school. And so through discovery, we learned that we were looking for tasks that he could follow a familiar route with familiar people, and there would be periods of standing and walking and sitting. And that on the days when his mobility wasn't very steady, he would have something such as this heavy-duty work cart that would help him in his mobility and with his job. So he ended up developing a delivery business. And so he always had somebody driving him, but we used a work incentive called a pass plan. So he bought his own van, and VR made it wheelchair accessible for him. And this was something he started in school, but continued with support after school. So as we're thinking about work experiences for people, we're going to think about, oh, we just made that really big. So the purpose of work experience, thinking about, helping people see the possibility of employment for students. And once families see that their son or daughter can be successful in the community, and that also community members really enjoy their son or daughter, and they are supportive, they're not mean out there. Not everybody, but we have a lot of myths about how unaccepting communities are of people with disabilities, and that's not really true when we support them to be successful in an environment that's a good match for them. But families start seeing the possibility of employment for their son or daughter after that. And the having multiple work experiences during school is going to help provide more information about what somebody's long-term supports look like, maybe how to more creatively meet those long-term supports. It might give you time also to test out some different technology that the student could use. And then also help you fill in the gaps with what other skills and abilities does this young person need to work on through transition, maybe at school or in the community, to better prepare them for their next work experience. So I think of work experiences not being like 1 or 2 field trips, but being an evolution of experiences that get us closer to that final job that the person will transition into as they exit high school. So from here, we're going to give you a little bit of homework. So I know some of the state deafblind projects are coming to this webinar series with a particular student in mind. And so the attachment that we handed out it's called a plan to conduct discovery. And so the first part is really thinking about, okay, who knows this young person best? So, because you want to be able to go interview the person, and you want to ask them about how they know the student, what kind of activities they've done with the student, supports that work, maybe environments that work or don't work. And what you're going to be doing is taking descriptive notes. So try and get more narrative than, oh, the person loves animals, and then you just leave it at there. What you really want to know is what's the data behind that? Like, well, what did you see that led you to believe that? Oh, this person offers to feed their dog and walk all the neighbors' dogs. Those are some of the notes you might want. Then think about, so you're going to put a list together of who knows this student best, because you want to probably divide your team up and say who's going to go interview some of these people you're looking for more information about who this person is at their best and how to support them. And eventually, and initially, the interviews may not look like the real work specific, but this information will help guide you to what that ideal fit job match is for those work experiences. And for a younger student, you might be thinking about work experiences in the school, or you might think about a volunteer experience in the community, in a nonprofit. But for some of your older students, you might be thinking with the support of Vogue Rehab, we're looking at our first community-based work experience. And maybe it's paid, maybe it's not to start. It just depends on where you're at. But before you go there, think about, how do we get to know this student so that we can negotiate a well-matched work experience? So also think about, what kind of activities does this student participate in that will give me some threads to who they are, what they like, what their skills and abilities are. So think about, maybe there's some activities they do in the community. Maybe it's something they do with a brother or an uncle. Maybe it's something they do at school. Also think about, what activities illustrate where this person has the least amount of support needs. And then a contrast. Because part of what you want to look at is, okay, what's the environment like? What's the activity like for least support needs and most support needs? Because you're going to factor that into your conditions for your work experience. So Teresa, do you have anything else to add around, like, hints of things to look at? Teresa has recently just gotten certified as a provider of discovery for Vogue Rehab through Mark Golden Associates. Her focus has been more on adults, but so think about it, Teresa. Are there other things that you would think of, other discovery activities you would recommend as people are going to go get to know a student to design a work experience?
For me, one of the pieces is that we're so used to looking at what folks can't do that it's wonderful to give people that opportunity to talk about what they can do. A lot of times when I'm interviewing someone, I want them to think about this person having a really great day. So I want them to focus on when that person was having a great day, what they were doing, and so to spend some time with that, instead of half empty, half full, focusing on what the positives are in this person's life and where they're successful. So that's been interesting for me. Another piece is that as we're doing discovery, It's interesting how positively this is impacting the individual around discovery, how they are feeling more confident, more willing to try things because they're getting some feedback of what they are able to do and highlighting how they are successful. So that's been impressive to me, how that impacts people. The last one has been kind of interesting for me to work around, in that when I'm looking at what motivates an individual, that sometimes those experiences. So for one young lady I was working with, the motivator was a uniform. She was so excited about the idea of wearing a uniform. That meant a great deal to her repeatedly in work environments. And to have money of her own to spend. As she has gained that experience, she's much more motivated by what she's going to purchase with money now than that uniform was in the beginning. On the flip side, I had a young man who was presenting as very interested in earning his own paycheck, had that brief opportunity a few times, but now because some of his interest is in journalism, he's far more motivated by seeing something that he has written be published and be in print. So those motivators with experiences sometimes change, but again, it's understanding what is meaningful to that person. So those would be pieces that I'm finding and discovering and learning as I go along. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, Teresa. So I'm apologizing. We're about to have a total bark fest. But think about, are there some questions that you all might have about some of this information and how it applies to the students you work with? And I'm going to mute myself so you guys can ask.
Hi, Ellen. This is Kim, and just wanted to apologize. We did have a few times there when Teresa was speaking when she cut in and out, and we apologize for that. We did some muting in the background, and hopefully that helped. If there was any piece of what Teresa was saying that you missed and you would like to follow up with on, go ahead and type that into your chat, and we can ask Teresa to repeat whatever piece you might have missed. A question that came in earlier when you were introducing customized employment, Ellen, was, I'm totally bought into the concept of customized employment and I'm excited about the possibilities. However, I work with job coaches who may have been in their position for a long time, and they are not open to the discussion that customized employment is something different than job carving. What would be the best way to have a conversation with them about job carving as compared to or contrasted with customized employment?
That's a really good question, and I think there's been a lot of confusion about how customized and supported employment differ or are the same, and also how does job carving fit into customized employment. And job carving is a strategy that you may use in customized employment. And I think one of the best tools is going to the, I'm gonna blank on the name of it. It's the essential components of customized employment, and it should be on the WinTAC website. Would be www.wintac.org. And that really clarifies what has to be included in discovery or in customized to make it customized. And that was something that was developed by a lot of the leaders in the customized employment field. So what I would say is that job carving, traditionally, what we did in job carving is we took an existing job description and carved away the things that a person couldn't do from that existing position. What we do in customized is we start with the person and look at what tasks they can offer an employer. And so as we're negotiating that position with the employer, we may actually look at some of their unmet needs, and we'll look at tasks that aren't getting done. They may come out of an existing job description, but the job description isn't where we start. And that's when I think of job carving, that's traditionally how we did it, was we started with that existing job and carved out a few select tasks that the person could do, or carved away the tasks that they couldn't do. In Customize, we really start with the person and then generate a task list, and then go to the employer, look at their unmet needs, and come up with tasks from the unmet needs, and then match them to what the person brings. So it's a subtle difference. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ellen. The next question is about finding age-appropriate, individualized vocational and transition assessments. Who has developed good tools for this type of assessment, and are those tools available to us? And I wonder if you'd like me to advance to some of the next slides, because you have some resources on there that might help answer this question.
Exactly. I think if you go to the NTACT slide, actually this would, yeah, the slide before, sorry, the IDEA resources, IDEA resources, there's going to be information here on age-appropriate transition assessments. And then on the final slide, the National TA Center on Transition, they have a whole age-appropriate transition assessment toolkit. So they have a lot of information. And they do reference the process of discovery, and citing that for students with a significant impact of disability, we're really going to need something like a person-centered planning strategy or the process of discovery to really highlight what the possibilities are, instead of, as Teresa said, just focusing on things people can't do.
Thank you. Any other questions? Those are the only ones that have come in so far. Okay, we did have a request for the corrected registration link for the April webinar, and that is posted on the Montana Deaf Blind Project website and also on the Transition and Employment Project's website, and both of those should be in your chat box. I sent those out at the beginning of today's webinar, and so you can access the registration link and the recording from today's webinar when it's available on either of those web pages. I don't see other questions. Ellen, did you have other comments or other slides you wanted me to go to before we do our closing remarks?
Actually, I would like to, for folks that aren't part of the Deafblind Network who are on this call, I do want to point you to the recommendations to improve transition outcomes for students with deafblindness and additional disabilities. These are some recommendations that the transition leads at NCDB have been working on. And what we did was we put together resources about 6 different recommended strategies to improve transition outcomes. And within those strategies, there's links to different resources that you can go look for in your state about customized employment, about, there's links to the National TA Center for WIOA. There's lots and lots of stuff in here that even if you don't work with students with deafblindness, might be real applicable to you. The next slide is the U.S. Department of Labor Office of Disability Employment Policy. And like we said initially, they are the first ones that coined the term customized employment. They have a lot of resources on their website around customized employment for employers, for job seekers. I think there's also a DVD around students and customized employment. There's probably other resources that would be real helpful, especially as you're trying to communicate to people about what is this thing called customized employment and why should we be thinking about it for this set of students. And then the other one that we didn't look at was the employment first movement. There are a lot of states around our country that are creating legislative directives and executive orders around funding for human services. So in some states, if they have an executive order saying that developmental disability services for adults, the priority is to support people to work in the community over sheltered settings or non-work settings, that's really going to impact the direction of your state in terms of funding for students as they exit. And so this page gives you some more information about Employment First. And within the recommendations document, there are some links so that you can look up where your state is in terms of Employment First. Because states are all over the map here. But that's going to help you think about, wow, are there some additional supports in your state that can help you really advocate for quality work experience for kids with a significant impact of disability, including deaf blindness. And that's all I had.
Okay. And there was one final question before I do the closing housekeeping. Is it best to get training on discovery, or do you think I could pull enough information together to do justice to the process? I know it's a loaded question.
You know, I think you can start doing discovery now, and I think you can benefit from training in discovery. And if you have access to that, I would highly recommend getting additional training. But I think starting with an optimistic view and starting to implement some of these strategies, and then coming back to the next webinar and sharing with us what you tried and where maybe you're stuck and want some more help, I think that both would be great activities for you.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to all of our attendees today that when you log out of the webinar, a short survey will pop up. Please do take the time to answer those questions. We really value your feedback. The next webinar in this three-part series, as Ellen mentioned, is called Using the Strategies of Discovery to Learn About the Student. It will be held April 16th from 1 until 2:30 Mountain Time, and registration is currently open. You can go to either the Montana Deaf Blind Project website or the Transition and Employment Project's website and register there. Also, if you are part of the Montana Transition email list, and that was a question you were asked when you registered for today, whether or not you wanted to join that list, we will be sending an announcement out to all of the members of that list, and the registration will be available through that announcement as well. Just a reminder that the recording from today's session will be posted to the two different training archives pages, again, to the Montana Deaf Blind Project page and to the Transition and Employment Projects page. It can take up to 2 weeks for us to get the recording posted. And I'd like to thank both Ellen and Teresa for the fabulous information that you shared today, and to all of our participants for taking the time to join us. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.